I'm delighted to welcome you to this partner event today. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you so much for joining us. I really hope that this will be the first of many opportunities for us to meet, perhaps even in person someday, let's hope. Really looking forward to hearing what is important to you and exploring together new collective opportunities for change. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rebecca Finley. I'm the new CEO at the Partnership on AI, and I'm really particularly excited to have this first conversation with today's partner panelists as a kickoff to a series of discussions on the next 5 years and AI. And I really can't think of a better group to get started with. So I wanted to begin our time together this morning just to quickly bring you up to speed on the consultations that I have had with many of you over the last several months regarding our new strategic plan and the renewal of our theory of change. And really to thank you all for your advice, wisdom, and guidance. It has been so helpful to me as I take on this role and as I work with the board and the staff to chart the future directions for this organization. In terms of the context within which we work, we all know that there continues to be rapid development underway in AI technologies globally. We know that the AI society and ethics research space and advocacy space is increasingly active and engaged. We have a much better understanding today of the disproportionate harm that is occurring for minority populations globally, including people and especially people working and living in low to middle income countries. We're starting to see governments and regulators respond. That began in Europe and is now emerging in North America. And so as a result, while we at PAI think about multi-stakeholder community building and collective action as being more important now than ever, it is also perhaps even more challenging than when PAI first launched. So in this context, you told me that PAI needs to renew and redefine its partnership with you. You've also told us that PAI has made an important contribution to date through its unique capacity to bring together and spark ideas between organizations and individuals who wouldn't otherwise talk to each other. And we need to keep this central to our partnership moving forward. And you've asked us to focus on emerging trends and topics, global community building, action informed by research, and partner and public accountability. So taking all of that in, we have identified for ourselves 4 outcomes that we would very much like to contribute to over the next 5 years and are really defining what success will look like for us. So first, and clearly importantly, an international, inclusive, and equitable PAI community of partners, thinking about how we shape that intentionally with all of you. Working to make sure the public is better informed about the social and societal impacts of AI. Catalyzing innovations in public policy by governments worldwide, and then supporting change in practice by our PAI partners, whatever sector they may be in, and using this change to drive and inform action in broader communities. So with those 4 sort of success indicators in mind for ourselves, we've really been forming our theory of change around 3 important areas of accountability. And the first is really around convenings. It is what can we uniquely do to stand up timely convenings with a diverse group of stakeholders internationally around the world on emerging topics and trends, bringing together experts in relevant areas and people at highest risk of being harmed by those AI applications. Second, how do we focus on really developing in partnership with you, high quality, accessible, relevant PAI resources, tools, and recommendations that are informed by an international and diverse community and support that change that we want to make in the world, whether it's through practice, public policy, or public understanding. And then finally, how do we ensure that as we do those first 2 pieces of work, we also are accountable? So how do we stand up our capacity in terms of research and reports that track and demonstrate progress in partner practice, as well as in public policy and in broader understanding. And so with those sort of as our guideposts, as we think about our work with you over the next 5 years, we really want to encourage new ways of thinking about how we can engage with you. So how we could work with you, help us to identify, as we are going to start to do today, some of those next big questions, those questions that we should be focusing on in future convenings. How do we create space for you to share the work that you're doing with other partners to intentionally make our community better connected and better informed by each other's work? How do we ensure that we offer up opportunities for you to participate in our current programming, whether it's through pilots, use cases, steering committees, working groups, a number of other initiatives. You'll hear about some of this in the breakout discussions, but look forward to talking to you further about all of that work. And then really hoping to be able to reach out to you, to seek expert advice when needed, to really look for your guidance around particular projects or programs, and then create opportunities where we can all come together to engage through all partner meetings and other opportunities in a more intentional way moving forward. We're initiating a new work together with some of our partners around inclusive research and design. We'd love to talk to you more about that and understand how that could inform the work you're doing, as well as participating in policy convenings. So really, as we now turn into the panel, what I wanted to make sure that I said to you as clearly as possible as I could this morning is that please don't hesitate. Reach out to me directly, to any member of the PAI team after today. We want to hear more about the work you're doing. If there's anything that emerges today that is of particular interest to you, please do be in touch. We would really like to explore it further with you. So now I'm going to turn over to our panelists and a conversation really shaped by that question of what is next in the next 5 years of AI. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our panel of partners today. They are reflective of our PAI community because this is an extraordinary group of individuals from around the world. I was just chatting with them and noting that we have panelists from London, Nairobi, Texas, and California with us today. So really, this is one of the great things about Zoom, is the opportunity to be able to connect easily. So I thank them all for being with us. I'm going to introduce them to you briefly, and then we'll move into some conversation. So let me begin with Mugendi, who is the program manager for Meedan in sub-Saharan Africa. Meedan, as you may know, is a software development startup that builds tools for journalists and human rights organizations. Mugendi has worked to advance the cause of accountability through access to credible, timely data, and has contributed to the growth, reach, and visibility of fact-checking and other forms of accountability journalism on the continent. We are so happy to have you with us today, Mugendi. Thank you. We also have with us Brittany Smith, who is the policy director at Data and Society, an independent nonprofit research institute that produces original research on the social implications of data-centric technologies and automation. Prior to joining Data and Society, Brittany worked at Alphabet, where she helped build DeepMind's first ethics and policy team. She led the company's work on partnerships and public engagement around AI policy, human rights, and racial justice. Brittany, it is great to have you with us today. Thank you so much. We also have Lauren Thomas, who is a research scientist at IBM Research. She is focused on the development of responsible and inclusive technology, including practical approaches for fairness and inclusion in AI, data representation, and projecting technology's impact on society and the environment through a lens of social justice. Her second area of research is the use of critical theories in engineering education. Hi, Lauren. Thank you so much for joining us today. And finally, Sarah Treuhaft, who is the Vice President of Research at PolicyLink and develops research agendas to support PolicyLink policy priorities, oversees research across the organization, and expands research partnerships. Sarah launched the All In Cities Initiative, the Jobs for All campaign, and the Bay Area Equity Atlas, and has led numerous partnerships with grassroots advocates, academics, and national organizations to use data to advance policies to achieve racial and economic equity. Sarah, thank you so much. It's great to have you with us. So let's jump right in with that first question, which was really about thinking about the 5 years and about impact and the outcomes that you all would like to make happen in the next 5 years. What do you think? What are those one or two most important questions that you think we as a community should be working on together? And what is the change that you'd like to see happen out of those? So who would like to go first? Mugendi, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rebecca. And I think just looking at the context in which we work as Meedan in the Global South, I think one of the main things that we need to discuss is how this part of the world can catch up with the rest of the world in terms of how platforms not just see us, but also how decisive actions are taken and decisions are made. So I'm seeing more of a push towards inclusion and more of an identification of exactly where the gaps are and how bad these gaps can be, because we've seen a lot of times that some of the gaps in terms of regulation and response to crises can be quite late in terms of effectiveness. And the other thing that we've seen is a lot more people in the Global South are coming online for the first time in contexts that are really difficult. So we've seen situations where there's very limited press freedom, but there's all of this access to information and people don't have points of contact for verification of this information. So it's important to highlight not just the work that all of the organizations that are part of the partnership are doing, but also to identify organizations in these parts of the world that are already working to do things like media and information literacy, and also trying to advocate for the rights of the people, of the users on these platforms, and all of these people who don't have the same level of access that other people in other parts of the world have. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I think that's such an important global context for us to be aware of as we think through this question. Sarah, I'm thinking about your work and the work that you do specifically with grassroots organizations and how you build those connections and linkages. Would you like to jump in next?
Sure. The two things that I was thinking about are power and measuring equity results, right? So I think we have this fundamental question of how do we shift power in this space of tech and AI, given how it's stacked right now, right? Where white men are dominant in all of the roles of leadership, CEOs, venture capitalists, data scientists, right? So, I mean, that's where we are now. And how do we shift power so that those who are most impacted, most negatively impacted, have increased voice, power, control, decision-making authority, and ownership, right? And are benefiting. So power is critical, but then also I love how, we have been talking about inclusion a bit. Rebecca, it came out in your statement around your changing direction. And there is this focus on equity and inclusion. And what we really need to get to is accountability there. So it's easy to talk equity, much, much harder to commit to achieving equity results. So how do we measure that? How do we hold ourselves and others accountable to actually achieving these shifts in power, shifts in resources?
Thanks very much. Such an important piece around measurement and accountability. And Lauren, I'm thinking about your work and how you've been leading some of that at IBM Research. Do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, so, and definitely thank you to Mugendi and Sarah for, really giving that broad stroke, because I think that from a research perspective, there's this accountability that we have yet to fully realize when it comes to responsibility in the ways that we develop and deploy technologies into the world. And that has to be formed from a very interdisciplinary, intersectional, and a grassroots informed lens. So kind of some of the things that Sarah was talking about, if the power is kind of concentrated in a specific kind of identity, a specific worldview, that doesn't apply in a global context. And we have to be responsible in how we're thinking about inclusion. And it's, in part, it's not just, there's the power of who holds the roles, who does the work, who decides what the work is, but also, when do the benefits of AI and technologies reach the masses? When do when does the benefit of AI reach everyone at a global and equal share? And how can we think about reducing the amount and the ways that exploitation happens, both in a power sense, in economic sense, rights and liberties sense? So there's quite a few things, but I think that as we're thinking about like what's next in the next 5 years, is how do we actually own that responsibility as technology developers, researchers, and people that are, we want our technologies to have a global impact, but we have to be accountable and fully understand that. And from my perspective, that comes from better interdisciplinary and cross-sector collaboration, as well as global collaboration, so that we can actually achieve these goals and hear and see each other before we jump to the technology.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Brittany, over to you.
Thank you. And thanks for organizing this. My thoughts on this question are super specific, but building on comments so far about power and equity and concentration of resources, and something I know lots of us are already working on. But I think one of the most important things we can establish and maintain, especially within government, is a grounded and nuanced understanding of what AI is and what it isn't. And to facilitate more engagement around the technical and ethical limitations of the technology. Like, lots of us have had this experience where we launch into our research and our talking points, and then someone says like, wait, what? Like, a computer can do that? Like, what do you mean? And I think because we've been having this conversation about the importance of AI for so many years, it can be easy to forget that lots of other people have no idea what we're talking about. And that's completely valid. It is fair and reasonable that people are still getting to grips with exactly what this technology is, what it isn't. And that's especially the case in light of the fact that we're seeing lots of high stakes deployments of AI and algorithmic systems more generally, at the same time as those same systems are being rigorously researched. So I'm in favor of working toward more resources and more discussion about the basics, which I think is more than just educating people, but about us expanding the coalition of people and organizations that are participating in the conversation about where the technology is developed and deployed.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think that I love the framing that you've all provided, both in terms of the envisioned future, the current challenges, and then the processes. What do we need to do together to get there in all sorts of different ways? And what I'd love to hear from each of you now is sort of within that, both that broad challenge and opportunity for the future, and also what needs to happen today. What, in terms of work that you're doing, what is exciting you most? Where do you feel like you're really starting to get some of that traction that's going to drive that change moving forward? Lauren, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I think the thing that I'm honestly most excited about is developing advanced research projects in a participatory approach and way that engages and, again, hears constituents and people who are going to be impacted by these technologies. Some of what Brittany talked about, I agree with fully, because, especially as an educator, not everyone has a real clue of what AI is and does and how it affects their lives. However, when I think about the responsibility aspects of being a researcher, being a technologist, it is in part that I'm helping those folks understand that, and also leveraging their experiential expertise to advance research. So for me, that shows up in a few different projects where the primary focus is around collaboration with nonprofit organizations that are social justice, racial justice, and mission oriented. to address with communities the challenges that they face. And I'm coming at it specifically from a data empowerment sort of perspective, but how can we give communities the data that they need to be able to activate and engage their governments, their fellow citizens and others to ensure a better, positive, more inclusive situation, whatever that context might be. So sometimes that's in an environmental context, sometimes that's in a educational context. But from my perspective, the exciting thing is being able to rethink how we do research, instead of sitting on this perch as a researcher saying this is how I view the world and that is the only way, to really form that research approach with the communities that one are going to be impacted, but also really are represented in those projects, in the data that we're leveraging. So
thank you. I think such an important question about who's around the table in terms of informing that work moving forward. Does anybody want to jump in on that particular? Is that something that's exciting others in terms of their work, or other topics? Yeah, Mugendi.
Yeah, I think one of the main things that we've been trying to do is to bring together like organizations and accountability actors from different parts of the continent, because a lot of the things that people are doing in these spaces tend to be very similar, but they're not aware of the work that everyone is doing, or they're not able to, I guess, reach out, probably because of something like a language barrier. But by bringing them together and creating a community, not just of practice, but also a community that understands, like, these are the shared risks that we face as people working in these spaces and in these countries, and then trying to give them ways around that by connecting them with like key decision makers and key people in places that can actually help them out. And then also identifying situations where technology can actually come in as a driver of like collaboration, and trying to make sure that all of the people and all of especially the underrepresented groups in these spaces, so people like women working in media, or sexual minorities as well, are actually given a chance to say what they need, as opposed to taking like a prescriptivist approach. So it's not us telling them, this is what you need in terms of sorting out your problem. This is how other people are doing it. If you'd like to talk to them and find out how it works, then you can have that conversation. So we're here to facilitate these interactions.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Brittany, or do you want to jump in?
Sure. Thank you. Sure. I'm excited about work we're doing at Data in Society on what we and other organizations are also calling the Algorithmic State, where we're exploring research and coordinated policy efforts around the government's use of algorithmic decision-making systems and how those systems may uphold or undermine civil rights. So we just published a paper, for example, on electronic visit verification systems, which are an interesting example of the algorithmic state themes of practice. These are federally mandated apps that care workers are required to use in an effort to reduce fraud, waste, and abuse, but that in practice are actually eroding critical support for people with disabilities and older adults, while offloading significant and unacknowledged burdens onto care workers and care recipients. And so these systems are an example of the growing landscape of punitive technologies that target and criminalize low-wage workers and public benefits recipients, and of what happens when state programs prioritize promises of efficiency and standardization and legibility over the lived experience of people who have to live intimately with these technologies. And so our research on electronic visit verification systems and upcoming work that we have on the algorithmic state more generally, I think is really interesting and exciting, and an important component to ongoing work around the government regulation of AI systems, thinking as well about ways that the government is using AI systems or algorithmic systems more generally also needs additional scrutiny. And that's something that we're going to be working on a lot over the next few years.
Thank you. And I think pairing that with your previous comment about just lack of understanding and awareness and knowledge is really critical, right? Sarah.
Yeah, so I think PolicyLink is good at taking complex concepts like regional equity and equitable development and kind of making them actionable and showing, what are the actual policies and business models that can realize equity. So in this realm, kind of recognizing that the business model underlying big tech is up for debate now. There are proposed policies. Legislators are recognizing the need for regulation, right? And there are significant racial equity impacts of this business model in terms of worker power, in terms of access and democracy and participation, and the racial wealth gap and entrepreneurship, right? I mean, across the spectrum. But there's not great, there's not a strong equity voice yet in this tech policy debate. And so we want to equip equity advocates as well as tech policymakers, folks like yourselves and folks in the tech community, with a framework that shows the connection between the tech business model and racial equity impacts, recognizing we want to eliminate the harms, but also advance a proactive equity vision for what an equitable tech sector looks like, right? So we commissioned research, we've been speaking with advocates to develop this framework to release at the beginning around February, probably of next year, and a toolkit that hopefully is very actionable so that we can increase this legibility, as Brittany was describing, right? How it's like so many people just don't understand what is happening. We want to make it more legible and actionable.
Thank you. And I think, and as you said off the top around measurement, right? What does it actually mean in practice, and how do we measure and recognize it moving forward? Well, the first thing I want to say, just in terms of the work that you're doing and that exciting you about moving this field forward, I really want to just make sure that the partners who are around the table have an opportunity, should they want to connect with you, to learn more about that work, and that I know we are already benefiting from your advice because you're active and engaged with our program and development work moving forward, and it is informing the work that we are doing, but we also are looking forward to really thinking about how we better engage that into our work. Lauren, I want to come to this question of multi-stakeholder work and coalition building and what we can do as a community, because I know you are working and are building a team that is very interdisciplinary and intersectional, and that's been very intentional in terms of the work you're doing. Where do you think the opportunities are for this community and other multi-stakeholder communities to work together in this space?
So I think it's absolutely essential that we do have these interdisciplinary and collaborative ways to research and develop technologies, for sure. And having these organizations like PAI and other sorts of consortia give us this opportunity again to hear and see each other, also hear and see different perspectives, and that can give us a better outcome when it comes to the use of AI and the use of other technologies, because instead of being in this reactionary sort of space where I think that, because AI as a field has, was very insular in the way that we've developed and we've grown through a solely technical perspective without consideration for the social and, global impacts of the technology that we're developing. I think that, we have this opportunity to learn from each other, to be a bit more, I like to think about the term of like disciplinary egocentrism, and how can we dismiss that, especially for those of us who are, technologists, engineers. There's some of that is built into the culture that we have to let that go in order to be able to have positive impacts. And I think it's really one of those, the ability to be more interdisciplinary, to be more considerate and responsible around the impacts of our technology that we develop is incredibly important for AI to continue to be a socially acceptable tool. So if by chance, at some point, because we are starting to identify, articulate, and advocate against specific kinds of use of technology and AI, the options are to end the use of those technologies entirely, or to do a better job of fixing them and making sure that we are accountable. So I would suggest that it's important for us to think about how we can continue to learn and grow from each other with a lot of humility and collaboration to help ensure the future of AI, and as well as our shared global future.
Thanks. Thank you, Lauren. Such an important point. Okay. Mugendi, do you want to jump in here on the whole question of multi-stakeholder and the work that you're doing, I know, around building coalitions across Africa, and how that works internationally?
Yeah, I think it's important to, as Lauren pointed out, look at all of the people working in these different disciplines, because sometimes the impacts that people in one field are seeing may not necessarily be visible in people in another. So if a tech tool is built and it's used and potentially abused in a very different context from what it was intended to do, it might be actually invisible to the people who created it. So it's important to make sure that all of these different conversations are being had, and then that all of these people working in different contexts are able to come together and point out, like, these are the gaps in this particular area. What can we do to fix them? Because it's important to make sure that it's not just like one conversation amongst people from one pool of experts, but it's multiple conversations, and then trying to find the intersections. And then even when the representation isn't really there, what can we do to fix it? Because I think one of the very, I'd say that the really cool things about groups and coalitions like these is that we all represent different networks. So essentially bringing everyone together and creating like a network of networks. So we know, for example, if there's people working in, let's say, machine learning, and other people who need to use machine learning to look at, let's say, election data, it's really possible to make that connection without these people having to have these conversations on their own. So we need to have essentially a hub of all that brings together all of these people, and then for everyone working in these spaces to know where to go should they need some kind of input, or should they have, for example, a need for like even user research, trying to see, for example, is there any potential for like wrongful use, or is there any actual beneficial use that the people who created these tools might not have seen. And then so in turn, what we should be able to build is a community that doesn't just represent like one perspective, either geopolitically or like in terms of practice, but something that is very broad and very inclusive, and also that can actually be useful to all the people who are part of it. Yeah.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, I think that just building off of what Lauren and Mugendi said, like, I think that this like idea of knowing together is empowering. Like, Manuel Pastor, who's at USC and has done a lot of research around what makes regions more prosperous, and he found that regions that had these multi-stakeholder structures where they looked at what was happening in the region and developed solutions together, actually did better in terms of economic prosperity. So the title of the book was Regions That Know Together, Grow Together. He's also very creative, but I think that there is something to this knowledge sharing. And I would just reference the experience that I had participating in the group that Katja pulled together. I think that having such cross-disciplinary learning around labor and standards around AI was just so beneficial. And then also, I think a really important part of it is bringing in worker voices. And like Lauren had said, like folks from the most vulnerable and marginalized communities, we did that. And I think that the session where we had Amazon workers describing their experiences was the most meaningful to all the participants. So more of that.
Great, thanks. Brittany, any comment on this one?
Yeah, sure. I think, and I've said this to lots of people, including the PAI team a lot, that multi-stakeholder work is really, really hard. It is really difficult. And I think it's really easy to forget that what we get out of this organization is directly related to what we pour into it. And so with that in mind, I think it's worth doubling down on investment in multi-stakeholder AI policy and governance work, specifically because there is simply too much happening for each of us to tackle on our own. And speaking just about the civil society work and space for a moment, we don't have to agree on the substance of every point to benefit from coordinating on sharing resources, sharing intel, sharing access, in order to scale our reach and impact. Like, why should 6 organizations be reaching out to any given committee or agency on variations of the same question? We could do that together and present a range of nuanced views when that's appropriate and when that's relevant to the space that that committee or agency is in. I don't think that's a new idea, and I think everyone participates in multi-stakeholder and coalition work in general, but having an implicit understanding of the dynamics that I'm talking about, but I hope moving forward we can be more explicit and more strategic about what we stand to gain by coordinating with each other on those specific points, because there is so much happening, especially on the Hill and in Brussels, and it's not sustainable for policy teams as small as ours in civil society to take on that work and to be influential in the ways that we want to be. And so I think PI can do a lot more to facilitate that kind of coordination and access and shared resource and intel about what's going on so that we can discuss together what might be the most effective.
Wow, well, that is the perfect message from my perspective to end this panel on. So I really should not say anything further other than thank you all very much.